Dear distinguished professor, deputy governor, dear authors, dear esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, the Central Bank of Hungary. Today, we gather here for a special event organized by the Hungarian Economic Association and the Financial and Economic Review, the quarterly journal published by the Magyar Nemzeti Bank. We are here to mark the publication of the commemorative issue of the Financial and Economic Review, celebrating the 100-year history and activities of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank. First and foremost, I am honored to invite on stage Mr. Barnabás Virág, Deputy Governor of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank and Chairman of the Editorial Board of the Financial and Economic Review, to deliver the welcome address.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished professor, distinguished guests. First of all, it's a great privilege to stand here and in the name of the Central Bank of Hungary and in the name of the Editorial Board of the Financial and Economic Review, welcome all of you in the occasion of the publication of our review, new celebratory thematic issue. 2024 was a very special year for us. The Central Bank of Hungary celebrated the 100-year anniversary of its foundation. But 2024 was also a special year for the Financial and Economic Review, as 10 years ago, the management of the MNB, in connection with its social responsibility activities and in the framework of broad support for education, financial literacy, and scientific activities, decided to take back the Financial and Economic Review from the Banking Association and renew it. In the last decade, we did a big journey. Following a significant content and formal renewal, our review has become one of the most widely read economic and financial scientific journals in Hungary, which also has a large readership abroad. Our objective was that the journal should effectively promote the examination and international presentation of the economic performance of the Hungarian economy and financial system, where appropriate, that of the Central and Eastern European region, as well as the analyzing evolution of the current issues of the economics, finance, and related disciplines, thereby also contributing to the successful renewal of economic thinking and economic policy activities. In this way, the Financial and Economic Review aims to create a unified platform for domestic and foreign researchers, educators, and readers with a scientific interest, which can be used as a starting point for a deeper analysis and understanding of the region's economic and social processes. Since the Central Bank of Hungary first published the Financial and Economic Review, hundreds of separate writings have been included in the regular issues of our scientific journal in the form of peer-reviewed studies, essays, feature articles, book reviews, and reports on conferences. The Financial and Economic Review is gaining more and more attention on the international level because of the contents available not only in Hungarian language, but also in English, as well as in Chinese. Our next Chinese edition will be published next week, just before the Chinese Lunar New Year. Let me say some words about the current issue. On the occasion of the centenary of the establishment of Hungary's independent central bank, the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, the Central Bank of Hungary, our scientific journal published a celebratory thematic issue in tribute to the 100-year history and activities of the MNB, containing studies by the governor of the MNB and renowned foreign and domestic central bank and monetary policy experts who express their thoughts on the bank's mission, its independence, and monetary stability, financial risk, hyperinflation, fighting for price stability, the impact of monetary policy institutional decisions on convergence and reserve requirements. In addition, the feature article published in this issue provides a review on the China-Hungarian green bond cooperation. In his study, Mr. György Matolcsi, the governor of the MNB, writes about the history of the MNB, which has been working for the past 100 years to establish and maintain price and financial stability in the Hungarian economy and to support its sustainable growth. It's also a great privilege that one of the most famous and widely read economic historian of our time, Professor Harold James, also wrote a study in this issue. Professor, it's a pleasure to welcome you here in Budapest. But let me tell you the whole list of our authors of the studies. We got a paper from Professor Barry Ehengren, from Professor Charles Guthard, from Professor Paul de Groot, from Manoy Pradhan, from Jeremy Yi, from Rainer Martin. Martin, thank you very much for that. From Piroska Nagymohácsi. Piroska, welcome you. From György Szapári. From Balázs Vonák. From István Ábel. From Pierre Siklós. From Professor Pierre Siklós. From Csaba Csávás. From Pál Peter Kolozsi. From Adam Banai. And finally, from Bin Hu, Chaui Chen, and Yuan Zhang. I hope my pronunciation was well. So I want to stop here. I think it's a very impressive menu. We have many studies about the history, and we know well nowadays that we are living in these historical times. So I strongly believe that better understanding the past can lead us to better decisions on the future. So please take the current issue, please read the articles, have a good reading, and enjoy the following mini-conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Governor Virág, for your welcome speech. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to invite Mr. Harold James, Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton University, to present his insights.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Governor Virág. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you also to the Economic and Financial Review for this wonderful, wonderful issue, which I think is very, very illuminating. And I think now, 100 years on, or just over 100 years on, from the founding of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, we're in a really interesting position also to look back on some of the lessons of that history. So let me think about those lessons. And I might also explain a little bit of the background. I started off working on the German central bank in the 1920s, in the aftermath of the colossal hyperinflation that Germany suffered and that ended in November 1923. And I'm currently engaged in a monetary history of Poland, which also has the same year, 1924, when a new central bank was created, Bank Polski was created, also in the wake of a big hyperinflation. And these experiences and those of Hungary and Austria are, I think, a kind of model for how one deals with extreme monetary events. In the late 1970s, when the world as a whole was suffering from high levels of inflation, not hyperinflation in the big Western economies, but substantial levels of inflation. I started my education in Cambridge University in 1975, when the rate of inflation in the UK was 25%. So we're not quite in hyperinflation there, but it's still a very, very serious problem. And the US was traumatized by the high levels of inflation, and President Carter, late President Carter, addressed the country and thought of this as a malaise. And in that environment, looking back at the 1920s, Thomas Sargent, later won the Nobel Prize, identified the experiences of Hungary and Austria and Germany and Poland as the crucial tests of how you did stabilization, and they were laboratory experiments in which the elemental forces that cause and can be used to stop inflation are easiest to spot. And the fundamental lesson of that paper was that it's relatively easy to end hyperinflation and to stabilize, and the cost is not as high as many people thought. So getting out of the inflation is a good thing to do and is relatively painless. And that's really what I think needs to be discussed, and what I try to discuss in the article. Because the question is, how do you really do this stopping exercise? And there are two alternative ways of thinking about it. One is to think about a country with very unpleasant choices to make, because fundamentally it usually always involves a big fiscal correction. So how do you do that? That's painful. You need to increase taxes, or you cut radically government expenditure. How do you do that? It's sometimes easier if somebody from the outside comes in and tells you what to do, because they can then take on all the blame that follows. And this is a common pattern. It's after the Second World War as well. In 1948, when West Germany started the currency experiment and the stabilization, the new currency, that was blamed on the Americans. All the unpopular decisions could be blamed on the Americans. And that was one choice in the 1920s. And people from then to today, I put on the slide a recent book by Jamie Martin, The Meddlers, which talks about how you get the intervention from the outside. And then the other alternative is to do it yourself, and to do this incredible exercise in imposing discipline on your own. And that was the way that the Germans tried to tell themselves that they were doing it, although they needed a big international conference to do it. And it was the way that Poland did it. So there was a contrast in these four countries, that Austria and Hungary both had the stabilization that was imposed from the outside by the League of Nations, and people from the League came and told you what to do with the budget and how to create a new central bank and create an independent central bank. And in Germany and Austria, in part Germany and Poland, in part looking at the Austrian and Hungarian experiences, said, we don't want this degree of external intervention. On the right-hand side of the slide, there's a placard, an electoral placard of one of the center parties, the German Democratic Party, right in the political center, advertising the fact that its most famous member, Hjalmar Schacht, had been responsible for the stabilization of the currency. So these are the two people in Poland and in Germany who make the new currency, Schacht, the president of the new central bank, and Władysław Grabski, the minister of finance, and the prime minister, who did the stabilization. Grabski keeps on saying it's important to do it on one's own, forgetting the foreign loans, forswearing British financial experts. You don't want people coming from the outside to do that. And it's primarily a fiscal story. And I think particularly in the Polish case, it's very, very clear that the level of inflation is fundamentally driven by the fiscal balance. And Oskar Lange, who later becomes a very, very prominent economist, already in his mid-20s at this period, thinks about the fiscal story as fundamental to the stabilization. The fundamental problem was dealing with the treasury deficit, and that's the way of analyzing it. The first head of the Bank Polski, Stanisław Kaczyński, the biggest plague for the Polish mark, the then currency that was replaced by the zloty, is the Polish treasury. The great Polish economist Edward Taylor, economic management becomes an instrument of the political fight, this political inflationism. And you can see, I think, on this logged curve, the very, very close correlation of the money supply and the state indebtedness. And it's a much closer correlation than to the external value of the currency. So how do you do that? Well, you need to tax. But taxing and balancing the budget, also cutting expenditure, dismissing large numbers of civil servants, is a very, very difficult exercise. So these are two figures who tried as finance ministers to stabilize their currencies. In one case, succeeded very dramatically because Czechoslovakia didn't have the post-war hyperinflation of the kind that Austria, Hungary, Poland, Germany had. But the finance minister who was responsible for this, Alois Rasin, was assassinated, as was Matthias Erzberger, the finance minister who had the only workable plan for a stabilization of the currency in the early stages, before the inflation really turned into a hyperinflation. Erzberger produced a finance reform, a fiscal reform, but was assassinated. So, you know, the martyrdom, as it were, of Erzberger or Rasin really tells you a story about the problem of fiscal stabilization. So you think somebody else has to pay for this, and there's a continuation, as it were, of wartime thinking, because the whole of the wartime finance, the enormous fiscal expenditure of fighting a war, was conducted on the principle that the defeated side will pay. And so the Germans thought that they would impose the lead weight of the millions, billions, on the necks of the defeated powers, and then in the Paris peace treaties, in Trianon, as you know, in Saint-Germain, in Versailles, the cost of the war was imposed on the defeated powers. So that kind of zero-sum mentality fades over into the discussion of how you need to do a fiscal settlement. The inflation driven by low savings rate, driven by fiscal pressures and what we call fiscal dominance, but also by financial dominance, in that the banks are dependent on continued monetization of their lending at the central bank. So it's both fiscal dominance and I think you can call it financial dominance as well. The consequences very briefly become apparent in all these countries, that there's social disintegration. And it's worth thinking about this, because when we think of inflationary experiences and why inflation experiences are so hard politically, also, and why you see the outcome, for instance, in the US election, why that is because when prices start to move very quickly, everybody thinks that they're losing in some kind of transaction. So if you imagine what you do when you go and buy something in a store, in a normal society, you think you're getting something you want, and the storekeeper thinks that he or she is getting something they want and they can spend on something. In the inflation setting, the customer is continually amazed by the way in which prices are increasing. So you think as a consumer, as a customer in stores, that the store owner is price gouging. And we've had a lot of discussion of that in the United States, of the extraordinary profits that people imagine that businesses are making during the inflation. And then, on the other hand, the shopkeepers are realizing that if they sell something, they could sell it tomorrow for a better price. And so, in a sense, the consumer is gouging them. So everybody thinks they blame somebody else, and also turning the attention on minorities. And finally, also, in a federal system where there's a problem about the capital city, and you think that the capital city is distant and remote, you often think that the central bank situated in the capital city is financing all the credits of the businesses and banks that are close to it. And so in Germany, the hyperinflation pushed a move to separatism. In the Rhineland, in Bavaria, in Saxony, provinces wanted to break away. And you get, I think, exactly the same mechanism in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, as you move into hyperinflation in the Soviet Union, and in Yugoslavia. It's not the case that this is the only driver of the disintegration of Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union, but it's one of them. So dealing with this becomes urgent. But what these stories also indicate is something that there's a nice IMF paper from a couple of years ago on premature celebrations, that it's actually not easy to do this. And both the Polish and the German case, where you don't get the foreign experts coming in and you don't get the supervision from the League of Nations, they turned out to be very, very problematic. And in particular, the stabilization in Poland is the first one to really disintegrate. They stabilized in 1924, got a new central bank in 1924, but then a big conflict develops between the central bank and the government, and the central bank's resistance to continuing to finance the government debt is what leads to the disintegration of the Grabski government. And Grabski is sometimes celebrated in Poland as the hero who introduced a new currency, but often denounced as the person who made an incredible mess. So a Grabski used to be a way of describing a political chaos, and it was not a nice phrase. And then the situation really only gets stabilized in 1926 after the military coup, after Marshal Pilsudski comes back and revises the government. This is, in a way, the key to the second stabilization. So in the early 1930s, one of the foreign experts of the Bank of England, Harry Siepman, said, what made Poland succeed in the second stabilization after this premature celebration of a first success was that what has happened is, to all intents and purposes, that Poland has abolished politics after 1926, after the Pilsudski coup. It's not an easy process. Sargent's description was much too sympathetic. Taylor, you think it's an English name, but actually this is a family that was in Poland since the 17th century, so I pronounce it Taylor, talked about looking continually for medicine. And I think, in a way, the nicest description of this was given a long, long time ago. I mean, in many ways, all the political discussions that we have today can be traced back to classical antiquity. And in Aeschylus's Eumenides, in the final final play of that trilogy, the chorus of the Furies, who are turned into a calming influence, so it's a nice metaphor of currency stabilization. Man to man foresees his neighbor's torments, groping to cure his own. Poor wretch, there is no cure, no use. The drugs that ease him speed the next attack. We often have that in economic stabilizations, that the methods we use set up the stage for the next problem. The drugs that ease him speed the next attack on us. So price stability is always a temporary measure, and it's difficult to maintain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor James, for your thought-provoking presentation. We will now proceed to our panel discussion. I am delighted to welcome Mr. Zsolt Kuti, Executive Director of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, who will serve as the moderator of the discussion. And I would also like to introduce our distinguished panelists, Mr. Barnabás Virág, Deputy Governor of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank and Chairman of the Editorial Board of the Financial and Economic Review, Mr. György Szapáry, Advisor to the Governor of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank and former Ambassador of Hungary to the United States and visiting lecturer at the Budapest Metropolitan University. Ms. Piroska Nagymohácsi, Visiting Professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Mr. Rainer Martin, Executive Director of the Národná banka Slovenska, the National Bank of Slovakia. Welcome, and I wish you an engaging discussion.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here, and I'm very happy to be here at the celebration of the Hungarian Central Bank's 100 years history. And it's a long history, but also the central banking in Hungary was even longer, because when we had a common history with Austria, central banking started already in a common institution. But in the world, the central banking has an even longer history for many centuries. And as we go back to this history, we changed that the institution, the roles, etc., has changed a lot. And even we have a lot of lessons. If we go back in time, we don't have to go back to many centuries, but even in the last 20 years, it has changed a lot. If you allow me my personal experience on this, as a young economist, I started at Citibank, which was that time a highly appreciated and highly effective institution, which means that it was very strongly understaffed, and we had to work a lot. And I wanted to come to the central bank, which should be a calm, peaceful, and very calm institution. It was in 2008, summer. I remember back after I came here for 2 months in the summer, I enjoyed everything. That it's much different and much better. After Lehman crisis came, and we didn't go home before, I don't know, 11 in the evening. So there was a very rapid experience that even central banking can provide very tough challenges. And in the last decade, last 2 decades, this was a full, it was everything but not peaceful, not calm, and also not stressful. And but it was also a long journey of studying. It was quite often learning by doing. The new challenges suggested us many things which we haven't seen before, which we have to react on it. And it was quite clear that these lessons provided us a very different approach what we had. If I go back in time, I remember in 2008 how we analyzed the things. I was responsible for financial market analysis, how deep we go, how kind of tools we used, how approach we used. It has changed very differently, but also in general, how we think about central banking and how we, what kind of tools we use, what kind of mandate the central bank had. It has changed even in the last 2 decades quite a lot. So therefore, I'm very happy to be here with my panelist colleagues and who have much longer experience in central banking, and I'm sure that they will also share their experiences in this topic. I would like to to, as we agreed before, I would like to turn this panel in three different parts. The first supposed to be a general approach where we go through on the lessons in the changes of the framework and the circumstances, how the central banks have worked in the last decades or even centuries. In the second part, I would go to the policy lessons. What have we learned in this long history regarding how to make effective central banking? And the third, supposed to turn to the future, what kind of conclusions we can withdraw from these lessons. So I would like to start with the first one. I have already mentioned that the role of central banking has changed very significantly. And even if you go back in the decade, because not only decade, but in centuries, central banking started in the 17th century. In this long history, not only the role, but all the approach, all the tools, everything has changed. And in each era had different challenges where the central banks had to react on. And there were some times where the central banks were more effective, and there were some times where they could not be quite effective. So my first question to our panelists would be that how do you see this long history? What are the conclusions regarding the framework? In which circumstances central banks could work more effectively, which helped their operational framework the best? And if you elaborate on the role of independence, I would be even more happy. So I turn to my panelists, and maybe, Yuri, if you could start with the question.
You want me to start? Okay, I've been at the central banks for about 25 years. So starting from 1990, I've seen many, many changes for the better, I must say. And I think one of the most important, most critical thing is for the central bank to pursue its mandate, which is price stability and financial stability, is the central bank independence. You cannot imagine central bank independence in an autocratic or a dictatorship. It has to be part of a system where you have the rule of law, you have democracy, you have independence of other institutions, judiciary, the media, etc. Then a central bank can be said that it's independent. Now, there has always been pressures on government, on the government. There's always been. And during Paul Volcker's time, in 79 and 2014, several dozens of laws were presented to the Congress to limit the independence of the Fed. Paul Volcker was called in to testify 10 times. 10 times. And then you can read now Trump also is putting pressure, etc. So pressure always exists, always exists. Most of the time it's interest rates, sometimes it's exchange rate. And to tell you a story, which I have also, Hans Dittmeier, who was at that time governor of the Bundesbank, and the Maastricht Treaty was introduced, and one of the conditions was an independent central bank. Chirac, who was at that time president of France, asked Dittmeier, Hans, how can I make it sure that the Banque de France would be independent? And he said, no, create a conflict with the bank and make sure that the bank wins. So you have to have examples of that. Last thing that I wanted to say, fiscal situation is very important, because if fiscal situation is too expensive, big deficits, etc., big debt, that threatens the independence via pressure from the government. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I guess all of us can agree and feel these challenges that we face from other circumstances regarding the independence. I would turn to Piroska, and I would really interesting on view on this issue.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to have contributed to this historic issue of the Hitelintézeti Szemle. I would just complement what Yuri so eloquently already described with a few distinct points. Number one is that central bank independence is a relatively new phenomenon, right? So in a sense, that came about in the latter part of the 20th century. And before that, central banks actually had been quite subject to government collaboration very openly. Their main mandate actually was not price stability. That's also a new phenomenon. Their main mandate was assuring the payment system and the financial stability, which of course, with independence and all that, was a little bit forgotten, focusing on inflation targeting. So my first point is, this is a relatively new phenomenon. It's a modern phenomenon, and I think we learn from history in that respect. Second, I would make a distinction between normal times of effectiveness and collaboration with the government, as Yuri highlighted, and then crisis times, when I think the type of collaboration, the type of coordination, the type of communication has to be very distinctly different. In normal times, I fully agree with Yuri, you have to have a reasonably independent central bank which have clearly set goals, price stability, but also financial stability, going back to the historic mandate of central banks, and very clearly highlighted in the wake of the global financial crisis very recently. So you have a normal period. Central bank is independent, has clearly set goals, has clearly set instruments that can be helping the central bank to attain its goals. And here the profession is very clear that the tools, in terms of tools, the central bank has to be really independent. So choosing what type of tool, the methods, what framework it chooses to attain the goal. So that's one set of framework. But the other one, as we saw, global financial crisis, but more recently the pandemic response, there has to be very close collaboration when there is a real crisis, right? And the Bank of England, during the first time of the first months of the pandemic, became a department of the UK Treasury. The Fed and the US Treasury were working incredibly closely, and here also I understand the collaboration was very, very close. So that's my second point. Distinction to be made between normal times, when central bank independence can be quite elaborate, very profound, independent, definitely in terms of tools, and then crisis times where there has to be a very close collaboration, otherwise you don't get out of the crisis. And we heard very clearly from Harold just now how important this is. The fighting hyperinflation, which is crisis times, was really a fiscal story, right? Not simply a monetary story. And then maybe I stop there. And let the others go, and we pick up on other things.
Okay, thank you. Just one comment on you. It's true that central banking independence became, by law, it's a quite new phenomenon, but it was very interesting to see that we go back in this in the historical speech when the Hungarian central bank was established. And Mr. Popovic gave a very thoughtful speech. We have a film about it. And there, the independence was a very crucial issue which he highlighted. And he mentioned that if we are not able to, because that's why it was a very deep crisis in Hungary. He said, if we will be not independent, we will not solve this issue. It was the general message. He made it much more nice, but so independence was also in crisis time, but you have also mentioned a very crucial role. And
can I add that I think that was also part of sort of breaking away from the imperial structures, and in that sense, the institutional independence was added an additional push.
Fully agree with it. And I was thinking that our thinking is quite often biased by Hungarian experiences. That's why I would turn to Rainer. How do you see this point from your experiences as a ECB, but now as a Slovakian central banker?
Okay, thank you, and first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So let me say a few words on top of what was already said. So you were asking about the effective conditions for independence. And I think the interaction with the government is, of course, critical. And I think in his fantastic speech, Professor James has already alluded to this and made that very, very clear. And I think this is something that we see also now in all circumstances. So there should be a work in tandem, or at least not an antagonistic relationship, because if that's the case, what you will get is a behavior by the government that basically undermines the monetary transition mechanism, and then your central bank independence is a lot reduced in its value. Let me also make one other point, which is not so much an issue, I think, for European Union central banks, but outside the European Union, it's a big issue. So I worked also some years in IMF capacity development, and for many central banks, it's a big challenge to have the tools to do their job. So they can be independent, but if they do not have sufficient staff, if they do not have sufficient resources, sufficient infrastructure, then again, the value of that independence is severely restricted. And let me get to the second point, because you also asked about how important is that independence in the actual operation. And I think it's very, very important. So, and on both main functions of central banks, both on the monetary side, but also on the financial side. So on the monetary side, I mean, we all know about the importance of the expectations channel in monetary policy making. And I think if you have sufficient credibility as a central bank, it allows you to fulfill your mandate with a much lower sacrifice ratio than you would otherwise face. And I think the recent high inflation experience proved that rather nicely. And the second point on financial stability, you see something similar. So let me give you here the example, because you asked about the situation in the Slovak Republic. So we are one central bank that is very, very active in the field of macroprudential policy. And I would say that the NBS is also very respected and has a lot of credibility in this field. And what that allows us to do is often to indicate that we are concerned about certain developments in the financial stability area, which triggers a reaction without us actually having to take any action. So I think that facilitates our life very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess you had a very key sentence here, that if you don't have central bank independence, it's much harder to create credibility and much harder to reach your targets. So even from personal perspective, personal experiences in central bank, we see also many challenges on this. So I fully agree with this sentence. And then we turn to Barnabás, to how do you see, even from your recent experiences?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Is my micro is working? Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation to the panel. I'm in an easy position to react after several very smart talks I heard till now, and I want to bring a new approach into this discussion, and that approach is the role of the megatrends in the life of central banks and in this whole history. So I absolutely agree with that. The central bank independence is a relatively new phenomenon. It's appeared in the 20th century. It became very strong in the last 40 years after the 80s. I'm always saying that the role of the central bank, the strength of the central bank increased very steadily in the last couple of decades, and I think the power of the central banks reached a peak somewhere in the last decade after the great financial crisis. I'm always saying during that time the central bankers were so popular, like the pop stars, like the rock stars. So in the last decade it was a very unique situation. The central bankers were able to print a lot of money, to provide cheap credits, sometimes with zero rates, sometimes with negative rates. So during that time, the central bankers were at the top, I can say. But I strongly believe that the life of central bankers is strongly, and the efficiency of the central banking is strongly determined by some megatrends. And I wanna mention three key megatrends from that. One is the geopolitical environment. The second one is the type of shocks we have to deal with it. And the third one is the level of debts, the indebtedness process. So of course, it's much easier to navigate in a peaceful environment. It's also true for the central bank. So that was the case after the 90s in our region. And of course, I think it's also a key lesson for the central banks. It's much harder to navigate when you are facing wartime. And that's the case nowadays. So we are pretty close to a war situation, a very sad war situation in Ukraine. And of course, it have a huge impact on our life in the central bank and of course on the whole economy. The second aspect is the type of the shocks. So I think the central bankers can navigate in a smoothly way in an environment where the shocks are mainly coming from the demand side. I remember I started my career in the central bank in 2003. So during that time, we introduced the inflation targeting in Hungary. And I remember the framework was that, okay, we have one target, so that's the inflation and price stability. We have one tool, so that's the interest rate. And as an economist, the task for the staff is to have the appropriate picture about the output gap, about the demand position of the economy, because that was the baseline scenario. The shocks are coming from the cyclical movement of the economy, and our job is to manage these cyclical movements in the economy in a proper way. But now we stepped into a totally new regime. So nowadays the key shocks are coming from the supply side of the world. And we are facing with huge shocks, with huge volatility on the supply side of the economy. And of course, the key task for the policymakers, not only for the not for the central bankers, but the whole policy mix, is to find a proper answer also on the supply side of the economy, to introduce the proper supply side reforms, and so on and so on. And the third factor is the debt level. I think in the last 40 years, the global economy was in a unique situation because the indebtedness of the government went to a very low level in after the 70s. So of course, in an environment where the indebtedness of the government and the key economic agents are pretty low or lower than the historical average, and we have strong economic growth because the demographic trends are supporting the economic growth. So the G is larger than the R, the interest rate. I think on that scenario, it's much easier to manage the central banking and to maintain the independence. And on that scenario, where this relationship between R and G, between the economic growth and the interest rates, start to change, I think that's the case nowadays. So nowadays, the world economy is suffering from low economic growth on the one hand, and on the other hand, we realized that the interest rates went to a higher level. So on that scenario, the dynamics can change also towards the central banks. But of course, I absolutely agree with the lesson from the history. I think the key task for the central banks is still the same: to maintain the stability in long term, and we have to focus on the inflation and on the financial stability. But we have to know the megatrends are changing and will have an impact on our own life.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, and thanks for enhancing the list of preconditions of the effective central banking framework. I would like to turn to now much more the practical policy questions. In the previous decades or centuries, the role, the mandates of the central bank has changed, we have already mentioned. But the general approach of central banking was always the key task was to provide stability. Whether price stability, how can we tackle inflation? Financial market stability, how can we ensure the stability of our exchange rate or our asset prices? Or financial stability. How can we ensure the stability of our the banking system, etc. So and we had always challenges in the histories, but I feel that the challenges became, or maybe it's just my feeling, but became even more rapid or more larger in the last couple of years in this crisis period. And I'm just wondering what kind of lessons could you withdraw? And I would focus on emerging central banking now, from this last decades or even from last years regarding how central banks can be effective in fighting inflation, or how central banks can be effective in fighting the financial crisis. And now I would I changed the order. Maybe I would start now with Piroska.
Such a broad question, so let me just start the answer and then leave my panelist colleagues to complement. And then I pick up on what Deputy Governor Virág just said, that one important element is the framework itself and the evolution of the framework itself. And in that respect, actually emerging markets, and we count still Hungary there, sort of very developed, but still an emerging market, feltörekvő ország. Emerging markets had made a virtual revolution. So the last 20 years, and we just published actually a study in Hitelintézeti Szemle last year, looking at the frameworks and the communication strategy of emerging markets. Emerging markets, so the main finding, the emerging markets framework in terms of transparency, in terms of the type of modeling they use, in terms of their communication strategy, has caught up to the best practice of advanced countries. And we argue in that piece, actually, that emerging markets overtook the masters, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, in applying the new framework when it came to fighting inflation in the post-pandemic and post-Russia war situation, energy crisis. So emerging markets excelled in applying their new framework. They caught up the quality, the data that they are using, et cetera, all the things that Rainer has already mentioned. And they used it very effectively in fighting the most recent inflationary period. So the framework is there, and the importance of the framework is that I would emphasize. But I would circle back to the first point. You cannot fight in crisis situations, the fight by yourself, the central bank. So you want to be independent, you want to have the instruments, you want to be able to communicate what you have in mind and clearly, but you have to collaborate with the government, because then if not, you can have a situation in which what the government does actually undermines what the central bank does. So coordination in that respect that Rainer emphasized is absolutely critical. So independence doesn't mean that you don't collaborate with the government. Independent means that you have a common goal and you coordinate an effective policy, and you don't have measures like in Hungary, the kamatshapka, sort of you undermine the monetary transmission mechanism by some government measures which effectively stops the impact, hampers the impact of interest rate increases, for example. Hungary was not the only one, by the way, in this. Just, I know that the example hits home more clearly here. So you need to have a good flexible framework. You have the framework. The Hungarian Central Bank actually has one of the best frameworks, according to our study, among emerging markets. Using that effectively has to be coordinated with the government, and making sure that the government efforts are not counterproductive in your fight of inflation.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that we liked your paper last year, even what you have mentioned that Hungary was one of the best performers, even on investor
independent research.
Yes, we have highlighted even in investor meetings when we always show our slides about it. And now I would turn to Rainer. How do you see this question from point of view of Slovakia, which has a special approach here?
Well, I mean, when you talk about Slovakia, of course, you talk about European Union, Euro area, monetary policy making. So I would make two main points. So the first one is that, as Deputy Governor Virág mentioned, we had the crisis periods. We discovered during this time many, many new tools. Now, do we fully understand them, how they worked? I would say no. So I think we need to further explore what actually happened. I mean, it gave us, if you put on the head of a researcher, it gave us a fantastic experiments, more than we wanted probably. But I think we need to understand that more. So there's a lot of a post-mortem exercise, so to say, that is still needed. And then the other thing is also that one should not forget about these things. So there's an issue of preservation, that you retain this knowledge in the central banks, that you are better prepared for when the next time comes. There's also one point that I would like to mention where I see still a lot of room for improvement, and this is a more holistic approach towards analyzing financial market and real economy development. So it's clear everybody agrees with this. Everybody says, yes, this is very, very important, and a lot of progress was made. But did we reach a point where this is sufficient? I would say no, quite frankly. I think a lot more work needs to be done in this field. And the same applies also if I zoom in on the financial developments. A lot of progress was made here. We have now much better micro and macroprudential supervision. But still there are a lot of gaps that need to be filled. So just one example that to me, for example, was really shocking, what happened last year with the Silicon Valley Bank. I think this came out of the blue. We did not expect this for sure. I think very few people did. So it shows that even in advanced economies, there are gaps. If you look at emerging market economies, of course, there are even a lot more gaps. So I think, so to sum up, I think retaining the knowledge that you have and filling the gaps that are still there, and I think there are still a lot of gaps, is crucial to be better prepared for what will come in the future.
I can fully agree with you in this very complex world. This interconnectedness of the measures creates such an environment where the policymakers can only guess or have feelings, but not create very exact models about the outcome. So we have also a very long history in Hungary regarding these challenges. And maybe I would turn to Barnabás regarding this. How do you see, what kind of lessons do we draw from this?
I want to mention briefly 3 lessons and 4, how to say, takeaways for the future. So the 3 lessons. Lesson number 1, as I mentioned in my previous comments, that we have to know that the type of the shocks has changed very dominantly. So nowadays we are flying in an environment where the role of supply side shocks can be large, can be very volatile. So just one example. So it was 5 years ago. It was pretty hard to imagine that in Hungary or in the European market, the gas prices can jump from 20 euro to 200 euro within a few months. It was no in the playbook. So I think the first lesson we have to prepare for a new era where the role of supply side shocks can be much wider. The second lesson is that in the current environment, the pass-through of the shocks towards the consumer prices is much faster in many cases. So in case of Hungary, but I think it's a common regional phenomenon that the pass-through of the import price changes towards the consumer prices become faster. But we can see much faster pass through in the financial market development. So there is a news in the table. The financial markets react immediately in a very volatile way. And the third lesson is that also the reaction in the perception and the expectation of the economic agents is much faster and wider in some cases. Especially linked to that information technologies we are using nowadays. So that's the role of the media, that's the role of the social media. We know how the clickbait approach is working. But looking at the Hungarian data, we realized several times in the last couple of years that the perception, for example, the inflation perception of the households, of the firms, increased in a much wider way than we saw in the last couple of decades. So it seems to me that the impact on expectations is also much faster and wider. So what are the takeaways for the monetary policy from these new lessons? I think one takeaway is we have to be more proactive. So we have to know that the monetary policies still have lagged effects on the economy, why, as I mentioned, the pass-throughs are much faster, so we need a more proactive approach in our decisions. Takeaway number 2, we need much stronger common work with other authorities, like the government, like the competition authorities. Or it's also an example in Hungary. So during the high inflation period, we saw that not only the supply side shocks caused the problem, but also the oligopoly positions and monopoly positions in the market, which increased the size of the shock to a very high level. So that's why we started a very strong cooperation with the competition authority. But we also have to know that the monopole fiscal policy nexus is also become more important. Takeaway number 3, we need more and more data, and we need more and more real-time data about the economy. And takeaway number 4, we need enhanced communication strategies. So of course, we have to use the new line of communication in the social media, in interactive webinars, in new platforms. So of course, that type of communication lines which were used in the last couple of decades are not enough in the current environment.
Before turning to Gyuri, maybe Piroshka would like to add something? Yeah. Sorry, Gyuri, just Piroshka would like to add something. Oh. No?
Okay, Gyuri, just one little thing that I thought mentioning, because we haven't touched upon it, and I think it's very important, particularly in today's geopolitical risk-laden world. One big lesson for emerging markets, as the question went, is that collaboration with the de facto systemic global central banks is absolutely critical at stress times. There are 3 de facto systemic global central banks in the world. One is the Federal Reserve, the US. The second is just next door, where Reiner's institution is a member, the European Central Bank, and the third is the People's Bank of China. There are some differences in the approaches, why they, how they play this role, but de facto, we are talking about 3 major central banks that drive the global financial and trade cycles in the world. This is a given. For a small open economy like ours, Hungary and others in Europe, like the Slovak, it is a very important fact. Now, you are integrated into this economy. So when there is a shock, it's very important that the central banks actually provide liquidity for the currency that, that oils the whole system. And it makes their currencies available to smaller countries, such as Hungary and many other emerging markets, to close the shock-induced gap, which is not because of their bad policies, because it's all external shocks. bottom line, the currency swaps or repo operations of these central banks have become a critical part of the whole global financial system. And it's very, very important to keep them, even if the geopolitical fault lines are emerging and there is regionalization and all that. And the last point in that it is such a huge advantage that our country, Hungary and Central Europe, is just next to the European Monetary Union, the ECB, the Eurozone, because that's one of the important global systemic banks, and its support can be critical at a time of a crisis. Many countries in the region outside the Eurozone did get support from the European Central Bank. Hungary got repo operations, should have received, I think, swaps, but that's a different issue. To keep these in line and for all the other countries that needed that is very important. Being next to a global systemic bank has very clear advantages.
I can just fully agree with you on this issue. We feel also on our skin the need for these facilities. And finally, I would turn this question to Yuri. Yuri, you were a policymaker, active policymaker already in the 90s. And how do you see, what is your personal lesson regarding the changes in this environment?
Okay, let me start again with a quote from Paul Volcker. When things are going smoothly, the central bank is not very important. It does not appear to have terribly difficult decisions to make. Only when things go poorly that central banks become prominent. Now, let me say what happened recently. After the COVID and after Ukraine, it was a surprise inflation, a surprise inflation. It was normal at the beginning that they accommodated it, but they should have started earlier. And the thing is that people think in level, economists think in rates. So people were looking back and they said, I don't know, food is that much more expensive, gasoline is that much more expensive. Now what you have to know that when you have a level increase, to make that an inflation, you have to accommodate it, okay? So what the major banks did, they accommodated it. And as a result, what you had was catch-up inflationary expectations. People looked at the past and not what was coming. So that was a key difference. Now, you talked about communications. I think communications are very important. And I don't know, discussing a lot in the Fed how to communicate. My opinion is that you have to communicate, you have to be transparent, but not too precise. Don't make too precise decision how much will be the inflation, how much will be the growth at that time. Because if it does not materialize, as it did in the past, in the previous, then that undermines confidence, and then again you have this catch-up inflation expectations. And you have to realize that when confidence is weakened, then what you have is people first save before investing and consuming. So that's the reason why I think communication is important. It has to be transparent. The central bank should not talk too much. It's one thing, and not to be too precise again on the projections, on the goals, but not to say it will be like this. Now, talking about the emerging markets are, as Piroshka said, obviously affected by major central banks, by major external developments. What emerging markets have to do, because what you have to know when there is uncertainty, external uncertainty, nothing has to do with the emerging market itself. Capital starts to move. Capital goes to safe haven currencies or more recently to gold. So emerging markets have to, in a free capital movement environment, have to prepare for that. How do they can prepare for that? First of all, with good policies, fiscal discipline, low debt, particularly low foreign currency debt, and enough reserves for intervene. Because sometimes you always have to, sometimes you have to intervene. And to come back again to the lesson of the inflation, of the recent inflation, what I was struck that back in end 2022, early 2023, I talked to senior management, IMF, Fed, ECB. They all said, it's temporary, it's temporary, it's temporary, it's temporary. So there was a group thing among central bankers. They meet every time they meet at the BIS, and there is a group thing. And that influenced, it was interesting that the first bank who started to increase interest rates was the Hungarian central bank. So you didn't have the group thing. But that was another problem, which might come back, And my final thought is, what are the major challenges? The major challenge is now that the inflation will come back, and inflationary pressure will come back, because the geopolitical uncertainty means that people will not spend, people will not invest, because confidence is affected. Then the governments want to stimulate. They want to stimulate. That these two together will actually continue to boost inflation, and there is a real danger, as far as I can see, that inflation will come back in the world, in the developed world. Thank you.
Thank you. I get some conclusions what you have mentioned, that central bank is not only able to learn, but sometimes able to forget. What I mean by that, we have forget, I guess, how long the shadow of inflation can be, I guess, and how harmful it can be. After many long decades of disinflation, we have forget how painful it can be. And now, unfortunately, we have to relearn it, study it, and it was a key, important lesson also for us. I guess to turn to the organizers, we have some more time, as I see. So I would turn to our third topic, to the future. Barnabás has already mentioned some megatrends which has formulated the past. But I guess there are many such megatrends which are ahead of us. Not to list these, I would now turn to Rainer. How do you see which are the key challenges ahead of the future of central bankings, and which are the fields where central banks have to react, which is not the task of the central banks, and how can we do it effectively?
Thank you very much. That's a very broad question indeed. I would raise 4 points. So the first one, of course, is globalization or deglobalization, and the Deputy Governor mentioned it already. But one important point there is that the impact that this will have on central banking is not so clear. You have, on the one hand, probably a trend slowdown in growth, which would imply a lower R star. At the same time, you have increasing price pressures, because the big de-inflation engine China will likely disappear, so that would speak in favor of higher R star. So what is the balance here? I don't think this is fully understood. And for the second point, which I would like to mention, it's the same. It's demographics. What does that mean for us? Again, you have a growth effect. Again, you have a price effect. And you need to balance, I think, what will come out, and how central banks need to react to this. What can you do? Well, research, more research, trying to better understand what is going on. Let me just point out 2 more issues where I think it's a bit clearer what is happening, but we still lack a lot of details. The first one is climate change and biodiversity loss. lots of work obviously being done in this field, and the MNB is of course really a front runner, and I think it's fantastic work being done here. But still, if you look at the output in terms of what does that really mean for our core mandate, what does it mean for inflation? There's not that much, actually. And I think we need to understand that better. Talking about climate change and biodiversity loss, there's even a problem on data, which I think needs to be urgently addressed, because this is potentially also very important. And the last point I would like to make, and Deputy Governor also alluded to this, is the change in financial markets. We have a lot of investment demand going forward to deal with all the challenges that we are facing. Can our bank-centric system do that? I don't think so. So I think we need to move in a direction where we have a financial system that is more heterogeneous, where you have more non-banks playing a bigger role, which is great. But for us, it raises again the problem that, first of all, the regulatory framework is less developed, and even the statistical database is a lot less strong than we have it for the banks. So those would be my 4 main challenges going forward.
Thank you. I guess we can share this also from the point of view of the Hungarian Central Bank. Even we have published 2-3 days back a big study about the future of megatrends. And I would turn to Barnabás, that from the Hungarian Central Bank point of view, how do you see these key challenges of the future?
In the short run, I absolutely agree with György that you mentioned. In near term, the inflation still a risk, and we have to prepare for a world where the inflation can a little bit increase again. So that's why we need a very patient and disciplined approach in the field of monetary policy. So that's our approach in the Central Bank of Hungary. If I look at the situation in the midterm, I want to mention three key challenges for the central banks. The first one is the capital position. The capital position of the central bank. So till now, in the last couple of decades, it wasn't an issue for the central bank. So we had a pretty, tight frameworks how to handle the capital position of the central banks. I think looking ahead, the new environment we have nowadays will keep the pressure on the capital position of the central bank. So I think that the central banks will fly with larger balance sheets on the one hand, but on the other hand, the mentioned inflation risk can maintain the interest rates at a higher level. So at the end of the day, the result will be a negative impact on the capital position of the central banks, and I think in case of many central banks, the capital position will turn into the negative side. So that's the case nowadays in Hungary. Of course, one outcome from this situation can be, further tensions between the government and the central banks. I think it wouldn't be a good outcome. I strongly believe that the key asset on the side of the central bank is the credibility, and we have to deliver our mandates in a credible way. And it doesn't matter what is the capital position of the central bank in that story. I think the Czech case is a good example. So in the last 2 decades, I think the capital position of the Czech central bank remained in the negative territory, while the central bank remained fully committed to the low inflation environment, and they delivered a very credible policy mix. So I think that's the right approach. So it means in the legal frameworks, we need a more flexible approach regarding the capital position of the central banks. In Hungary, we did it. So in the last year, the parliament changed the central bank law regarding the capital position of the central bank into a more flexible direction. But I can imagine in midterm this question can materialize in case of several countries. The second issue is the climate change. So it was mentioned. I absolutely agree with that. Here in Hungary, we have a more proactive approach in that field. So We are one of those central banks who have a green mandate in our legal framework. And of course, in our toolkit, we try to introduce new tools to support the green transition. But I think in midterm, it will be a question everywhere how to support the green transition in our life. So we can see the numbers in the Draghi report. So what's the needed investment in that field? We know the fiscal stories everywhere. So I think in some point in the future, this question will be a tough question for the central bankers. And I think a more proactive approach is better on that field than to be too reactive or in a wait-and-see position. And the third factor is the technological progress, so the digitalization. I think on that field, not in the future, now, there are big elephants in the room who are raising the question, okay, who will control the money supply in the future? So these are the tech companies. There is the Bitcoin story. So I think it's a need on the side of the central banks to find the right answers for these questions. I think the right answer is to participate in the technological progress and to do big step ahead in the field of CBDC projects, because the digitalization is the future, and we need very effective central banking also in the digital future.
Thank you. Yes, these challenges can create a very tough period in many aspects ahead of us. And now I turn to Yuri. In your very long history of central banking, policy making, etc., did this approach, how you have seen the key challenges ahead of policy making, central banking has changed, and how do you see the future? What are the key challenges ahead of us?
Well, we already have mentioned, all of us, the challenges. One thing that has not been put on the table yet very explicitly, although you just touched it, is what will AI do for the central bank's functioning? Because the financial intermediaries are multiplying, actually can satisfy credit needs, can create money outside of the channel of the central bank. So this is a very, very big issue, particularly for the financial stability. Thank you. But particularly for the financial stability. And I would just like to remind you, because we will have soon the non-policy conference, that non-policy 15 years ago already mentioned and was very much worried about it, as he could foresee the technical innovation. AI didn't exist in a way it exists not, but he already drew attention to the fact that this is going to be a big challenge for the central banks. So I just wanted to put this last thought on the table.
Thank you. That was not polite because finally I left Piroshka as a lady here. But if you could add to this question anything from the point of your international, more holistic approach, I would be very happy to hear.
First, I agree everything what have been said, and add my 2 cents worth of the importance of the central bank to fully engage in the digitalized world and not to be afraid of issuing central bank digital currencies. We see a little bit of a pushback in that regard. You look at the US, you see that you know, the cryptocurrency advocates have certainly gained. Effectively, looks like political power as well. I personally don't see a huge issue of private money per se, if it is treated as an asset. any other financial asset and not a currency. So it does not encroach on the monetary sovereignty of the central bank. If it becomes money, and that's where the pressure is, definitely in the US where I now live, that will bring, so that first of all undermines the power of the government, but importantly, if there's a crisis, who is going to support, the currency? Will the government step in and bail out Bitcoin holders if the price goes down, as it, fluctuates quite demonstratively, as we have seen, or not? So the big thing is that if there is private money, private credit, is there an implicit and expected government bailout in case of a stress? My fear is that if this private money becomes very widespread, and its use becomes very widespread, the populist pressure will be there to provide taxpayers' money to bail out that private venture. And that is just wrong. We will be seeing, in a very magnified way, the recurrence of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. So I think I see that as a major challenge at this point. Private public sector money in the digitalized world is a big challenge. And again, the bailout expectation that I think is there is a big risk. That's for financial stability. We already mentioned it's very important to understand the new tools that are being used. I just want to press, because we are in the central bank, a nice conference, there has been a certain abuse of quantitative easing. And there was an excessive use during the pandemic, post-pandemic, I would say, of quantitative easing by central banks in the world, but I'm not talking about Hungary here, we are talking about the Fed, the ECB. It was overused. And there is an increased realization, very good papers coming out about the perverse effects of excessive quantitative easing, the result of which, of course, are the very large government balance sheets. Understanding the implications that not only the unwinding and the profit implications, but understanding implications of moral hazard for private sector behavior is something that is missing. And we have to pay more attention. There's to be a little bit more soul searching of central banks in that regards. And finally, if you allow, something that is closer to home. In the new, very globalized, integrated world, as I was mentioning before, with global central banks and systemic central banks running the show, if you wish, de facto, the benefits of monetary sovereignty of a small, open, integrated economy have reduced. It's not as much important to have not as much effective to have your own monetary policy effectively as in the past. And in that respect, actually, our article in this new commemorative, brilliant issue of the MNB, I think is quite instructive. We compare inflation performance within in the Slovak case, which is part of obviously of the Eurozone, and three countries which are outside the Eurozone and how they manage the inflation pressures. And the point that we are making, please read it, a little advertisement, is that it's been beneficial to be part of a bigger monetary union. So the bottom line, in a very integrated world, small open economies, monetary policy sovereignty, independence is less important, I think.
Thanks a lot. Listen to your answers. It will be a tough decade for central banking because all of you could list a lot of challenges which are quite different from others. So, and if you allow me, just let me give another one. Basically, how can we handle the speeding up of economy and the speeding up of financial markets? Rainer has already mentioned the question of SVB. If you remember back quarter of the bank asset has left in one weekend. And even in Hungarian history, financial history, we have experiences how savers can go abroad. 10 years ago, it takes some time. You have to travel. You have to go to visa. Doesn't matter. Now it takes 5 minutes with any other applications. So I guess this is such a challenge for central bankers. Even we became also faster, but the environment became much faster than us. So how can we handle this very rapidly changing environment? I guess this will be a crucial issue for us. But at the end, I would like to thank all of you this fruitful discussion. I hope the audience has also enjoyed that. Or do you want? Any reaction from? Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yes. Okay, I thought that I haven't seen something, but anybody else would like to add something? If not, then I would like to thank again your discussion, and I really enjoyed it, so I hope all the audience have done it, and I wish all the best for the remaining part of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.